everyone again. I guess you can see my PowerPoint now. Yes, brilliant. So my focus this afternoon will be on the ways that comic playwrights of the 4th century BC and beyond construct aspects of gender of Hetairai. Having said that, a twofold caveat is in order. First, given the fragmentary status of the comic material, the conclusions can never be conclusive. Secondly, the term Hetairai is multifaceted and can have numerous versions, from cheap brothel workers costing half a drachma to concubines that cohabited with their lovers to independent Hetairai such as Phryne, who is reported to have capriciously asked to catch only a fleeting glimpse. It is common knowledge that Hetairai enjoys a ubiquitous presence and develops into a stereotypical character, often with significant role in the plot during the periods of Middle and New Comedy. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that such a central and nuanced character would be further singled out by its very own gender identity. The Hetairai's gender, as constructed by comedy, is indeed intricate and multidimensional. The Hetairai gender encompasses elements, behavioral patterns, and defining attributes from various gendersome domains, while at the same time it can be further defined via eclectic association and dissociation to aspects of these domains, which are the following. 1, the feminine, 2, the masculine, 3, the monstrous feminine, using Barbara Creed's terminology, and the kindred non-human. These two are closely intertwined, so I'm counting them as one. And 4, on top of all that, the Hetairai gender features some idiosyncratic traits peculiar to itself. So in brief, what we are looking at here is a hybrid, an amalgam. The Hetairai gender is definitely multi-layered. I would like to begin with a fragment by Amphis, where the Hetairai's gender is clearly demarcated and specified as the antipode to that of a wedded wife. This is what the comic character says while soliloquizing. And so, is not a Hetairai more well-disposed than a wedded wife? Very much so, and reasonably enough. For a wife, even if she is disdainful, gets to stay in the house by custom, while a Hetairai knows that she must either buy a man with her manners or go off to another one. What we have here is a social norm that translates into two different gender behavioral patterns. A wife can afford to be contemptuous and does not need to make any extra effort to keep her husband and sustain his interest, sexual or other, since the legal sanction of the constitution of marriage does this for her. Of course, in real life, things were slightly different, but this is not the moment to discuss the phenomenon of comic deviation from reality. On the other hand, a Hetairai needs to secure, metaphorically, to buy on a theos, her man, with her behavior, since her relationship is not legally sanctioned. The fragment probably refers to a case of cohabitation. This distinction leads to different gender roles and behavioral expectations, in the sense that a Hetairai could often prove more loving and caring than a wife, since she is perfectly conscient, oiden, of the fact that her status is not fixed, and that in order to prolong this relationship and avoid being sent away, prosallon apiteon, just like Chrysis in Menander's Samia is sent away by Demeas, she must constantly be loving and affectionate towards her man. In short, the picture drawn by this fragment is that of a Hetairai of a sexually aggressive gender. The expression is straightforward and revealing. The Hetairai knows, so the whole process is perfectly conscious and all action is premeditated, that she must anchor a man with her tropoi, her subtle manners and obliging behavior, the very elements that build her gender. At the same time, the propinquity between the Hetairai and feminine gender cannot be overlooked. For example, all women in comedy are notorious for their fondness of wine. But since this is common knowledge, I will leave this part for the written version of the paper and limit myself to an apophthegm by Athenaeus, with which he introduces a series of fragments dwelling on women's bibulousness, that women like wine is a commonplace. The idea introduced in Amphis' fragment, according to which Hetairai need to act, to assume initiative in order to secure their man, materializes further in other comic fragments where Hetairai appropriate elements from the masculine gender and are visualized as hunters. Their prey is their clients, and sexual aggressiveness is explicit again. Most arresting is Theophilus' fragment 11, where the speaker expresses his worries about the contacts of a youth with Hetairai. To save him from falling with a rush into Lais or Mekonis or Sicymbrion or Parathron or Talusa or any one of those women in whose nets the brothel keepers entangle you. What is particularly striking in Theophilus' fragment is the terminology used by the speaker, who explains that the young man needs to be saved from falling and pessim into Lais, as if he were about to fall into a trap or into a pit. Actually, the name of one of the Hetairai, Parathron, literally means pit, and into all other Hetairai in whose nets, Linois, the brothel keepers entangle the male human victims. As I said, terminology has been carefully selected here. The verb empipto, when followed by the preposition eis, is commonly used to denote entry into a negative situation. For example, a senedran, fall into an ambush, or a satas, plunge into evil. The present case is unparalleled in that the accusative signals a person, eis laida, eis mekonida, etc., prevent him, save him from falling into Lais. This falling visualization is most vivid in the case of the Hetairai Parathron, pit. This is a speaking name, a nickname, that graphically materializes the idea of the Hetairai being the ruin personified. Actually, as you may recall, in Athens, Parathron was a deep pit into which they used to throw the criminals, either dead or alive. As to the lina, these are literally the nets used to catch birds and wild animals, and fish too. The gender norm dictates that men hunt wild animals for both practical reasons and entertainment. Hetairai, adapting this predominantly masculine pattern to their own gender profile, hunt men for the same reasons. This tangible visualization is overwhelmingly masculine and aggressive. Hunting Hetairai use nets to entangle their male prey into their traps. As a matter of fact, certain famous Hetairai are indeed identified as traps of life by Gydes Tuviou in another fragment by Amphis. I think Plutus is blind, for he does not enter the house of this girl, but in the homes of Sinope, Leuca, and Nanion, and other similar traps of life, he sits senseless inside and never comes out. The entire imagery of some manly hunting Hetairai is epitomized by the very title of a play by Phileterus called Kynagis, the Huntress. The play's surviving fragments plus parallel evidence strongly suggest the identification of the title figure with the Hetairai hunting men. Even in Lucian, a Hetairai bears the nickname Pagis, trap, snare. Yet, although weird, the fact that Hetairai appropriate masculine gender characteristics is not entirely unthinkable nor grotesque. After all, there is the example of Euripides' Medea, who similarly adapts male gender features throughout the play, for different reasons, of course. What is conspicuously engaging is the third gendersome domain with which Hetairai share certain eye-catching characteristics. This is what I identify as the monstrous feminine, and this is where Margarita's paper on Simonides from yesterday becomes relevant. The terminology, monstrous feminine, is not mine. It belongs to Barbara Creed, professor of cinema studies at the University of Melbourne, who wrote a book about this notion in 1993. It's called The Monstrous Feminine, Film, Feminism, and Psychoanalysis. In this monograph, Barbara Creed rocks the boat and discusses woman as a monster. Focusing on 20th century horror filmography, Creed challenges all traditional and widely accepted feminist and psychoanalytic theories, including those by Freud and Lacan, and re-examines the assumption that the woman is always the terrified victim against whom monstrosity is exercised. Instead, she advances the admittedly controversial view that woman needs to be acknowledged more often than she usually is as the terrifying perpetrator who generates monstrosity. Regardless of whether one is convinced by Crete's argumentation, and of course this is not the time to engage in discussion about Crete's perspective, her conceptualization of the monstrous feminine can be applied, mutatis mutandis, including can be applied mutatis mutandis to comedies' inimical representation of Hetairai. Besides, all human societies, even the ancient Greek one, have and have always had a more or less consciously formulated conception of the monstrous feminine. For example, in Greek mythology, there is an abundance of female monsters. To mention but a few: Chimera, Charybdis, Scylla, Hydra, Echidna, the Harpies, the Sirens, etc. And this is exactly how Hetairai are presented in the following fragment by Anaxilas as mythical beasts as well as wild animals. If anyone's ever grown attached to a Hetairai, the speaker says, could you name a more criminal bunch? Because what fearsome dragon or fire-breathing chimera or Charybdis or three-headed Scylla or shark, sphinx, hydra, lion, poisonous snake or winged flock of harpies outdoes this revolting group? It's impossible. They are worse than the worst. And further down, you can think about it, starting with Plankton, who reduces the barbarians to cinders like Chimera. And as for the people who sleep with Sinope, aren't they sleeping with Hydra now? What difference can you see today between Nanion and Scylla? After she strangled two boyfriends, isn't she angling now to catch a third? And isn't Phryne behaving just like Charybdis by grabbing the ship owner and gulping him down, boat and all? Isn't Thearno a siren with no feathers? To sum up, however many wild beasts there are, nothing's more dangerous than a Hetairai. In this unusually lengthy fragment, a number of famous Hetairai are assimilated to either mythical monsters or wild animals, theria, which hunt down, devour, and ultimately destroy, financially that is, their clients. Thus, the elements of beastly rapacity of mythical dimensions complements the gender jigsaw of Hetairai, who are thereby portrayed as sexually aggressive and insatiate non-human creatures. At this point, the masculine and the monstrous feminine aspects of the convoluted heteric gender are intertwined. The monstrous Hetairai, who is hunting for both clients and money, becomes a stereotypical figure in Middle and New Comedy. Accordingly, Philippides uses the Homeric epithet androphonos, murderer of men, bloodthirsty, to describe the Hetairai Gnataina. Comparable to Anaxilas' fragment are a couple of fragments by Epicrates from a play called Anti-Lais, the rival or look-alike of Lais, or the vice Lais, whatever you make of it, where the rapacity of raptors, hawks, and eagles is compared to that of Hetairai. In fragment 2, the expensive Hetairai, the megalomistoi ones, are visualized as predatory hawks through a pan. These ones play only hawk's tune on the pipes. While in fragment 3, the behavior of Lais the Elder is identified through an elaborate simile to the behavior of eagles. Remarkably, Lais is described as teras. Given the context, this is a loaded term that can simultaneously mean monster, portent, and wonder. The next couple of lines are a throwback to Lais's youth. It is conspicuous that the bird imagery adapts accordingly. She is described as a neotos, a nestling. Lais is pictured aggressive and rapacious, nurturing a wild animal instinct, and we read that she was apegriomeni. She had become wild by the large starter coins. The analogy between rapacious predatory raptors and sexually aggressive, money-grabbing, actively hunting for clients Hetairai is a stunning conceptualization. Just a couple of remarks on the fourth and last gender domain, the idiosyncratic. Hetairai are often visualized making up their own image, constructing, or better say, fabricating, their own artificial, or should I say meretricious, gender. Most revealing is fragment 103 by Alexis, where the speaker describes how older Hetairai train new ones into the business And the first thing the older Hetairai do is that they reshape anaplatusi, the novices, so that they don't behave or look the same anymore. In other words, they are assigning them a whole new gender, the Hetairai gender. And in particular, a girl happens to be short, corks attached to the soles of her shoes. She is tall, she wears a thin-soled shoe and rests her head on her shoulder when she goes outside, reducing her height. A girl's got blonde eyebrows, they draw them in with soot. Her skin happens to be dark, her mistress covers her with white lead, and so on and so forth, so that all Hetairai live up to and fulfill the same stereotyped gender expectations. The eclectic association with and dissociation from the feminine, the masculine, the monstrous feminine, the non-human, and the idiosyncratic eventually generate a highly elaborate and multifarious heteric gender. Despite, however, the remarkable degree of intricacy, one can detect an overarching notion that arguably pervades and envelopes all aspects of the heteric gender. The Hetaira who needs to buy her man with her behavior, the huntress Hetaira who lures its prey into her snare, the monstrous Hetaira, Charybdis or Chimera or whatever, who annihilates her victim, the raptor-like Hetaira who locks on and swoops down on potential clients, the tricky Hetaira who blackens her eyebrows or whitens her skin, all have one fundamental gender feature in common: sexual aggressiveness and forwardness, interwoven with and further promoted by avarice and insatiability. By definition, this gender orientation is not only disruptive and counterproductive to the oikos and its perpetuation, but it can also prove destructive to its legitimacy. It is understandable that not all gender aspects appear simultaneously, and that the intensity of each component varies accordingly. At the same time, there is a limited number of comic fragments which, along with Menander, of course, deconstruct this rapacious and sexually aggressive aspect of heteric gender as they project Hetairai as complacent and honorable partners with a heart of gold. A textbook case is the figure of Chrysis, the Hetaira behind the title figure of Menander's Samia. Her apple-chosen speaking name, Chrysis, golden, matches with her decent behavior in the play. The quintessence of this diametrically opposite gender imprint is epitomized by one of the banqueteers in Athenaeus's Dipnospistae, who says, "What I have described are actual Hetairai, which is to say, women capable of maintaining a friendship not based on trickery." To conclude, when considering all relevant evidence shaping this multipartite heteric gender, one cannot help but noticing the presence of an explicit antipathy, even bordering with resentment, against Hetairai. The comic element that permeates the whole process of gender construction is not anodyne and often produces what Halliwell has identified as vulgar laughter that is expressive of hostility, as opposed to playful and sophisticated laughter that involves only a pretense of ridicule. As I have argued elsewhere, this animosity largely originates from the socioeconomic status, present and past, of Hetairai and their spendthrift clients. So not only is the construction of the heteric gender quite striking in itself as a dramaturgic conceptualization, but also it appears to have had deep-rooted associations with the era's anxieties over the contemporary socioeconomic transformations. Thank you for your attention.